Armoede, zo horen we vooral de laatste tijd, is een mogelijke voedingsbodem voor geweld. Maar van het probleem van de armoede zijn we voorlopig niet af. Ontwikkelingshulp hielp niet en ook de globalisering maakt de kloof tussen arm en rijk alleen maar groter. Is er een oplossing? De Peruaanse econoom Hernando De Soto denkt van wel. Want de armen zijn rijker dan we denken.
¿Qué haría yo si tuviera capital? 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 Voy a contarles la historia de un país que anda muy mal, porque un grupo muy pequeño tiene acceso al capital, negando a las mayorías su derecho al capital, negando a las mayorías su derecho al capital.
There is no one explanation for poverty, but I think that the missing one, the big hole, the big deficit, is in the legal system. People are always thinking of an economic system as being economic. And economic systems aren't economic, they're legal. The whole structure of a capitalist system is essentially a legal system. It's rules of the game. It is crucial in any developing country, if their desire is to become a market economy, to let the market function. But the market isn't the trading of goods. The marketing is the trading of property rights that are paperized. And things that are owned by most of Peruvians, things that are owned by most of third worlders, are not on paper. In effect, the idea that we're working on is the poor are the solution, they're not the problem.
Milton Friedman, Premio Nobel en Economía. The Economist, The New York Times. Ronald Coase, Premio Nobel en Economía. Margaret Thatcher, expert. La obra de Hernando De Soto que recomienda el mundo entero. El Misterio del Capital. La propuesta peruana para acabar con la pobreza en el mundo. El Misterio del Capital. Una solución de futuro. Ahora a nuestro alcance. El Misterio del Capital.
I'm a Peruvian brought up in Europe. And until the age of 16, I used to go back and forth from Europe to Peru. I never noticed the difference. It's only about the age of 16 and 17 that I realized that I, who at that time was living in Switzerland was a whole lot richer than Peru. I hadn't quite realized it simply because life for me, as part of the Peruvian bourgeoisie, was very good. And when I did that, realization, a crisis came, which is, why have we not been able to create wealth? So trying to find the cause of that was a continual concern all throughout my business life, and when the opportunity came to study it, I did. But it had to do with finding out why I could not see in the culture of educated Latin Americans anything that could explain our levels of poverty and abandonment. One of the interesting things, of course, about the discoveries we made when I came back to Peru and we founded the Institute for Liberty and Democracy is that everybody was in business. Basically, all poor people today are doing deals. They're buying land, they're selling land, they're buying chickens. They're doing it according, not to official rules, because they're in the black market. 80% of the people basically work outside the legal system, roughly. Not everybody is totally informal, nor everybody is totally legal. But in essence, it's about, according to the countries we've been into, it's between 70 and 80% usually. Now, that doesn't mean that it's 70 to 80% of GNP, gross national product, but it is 60 to 70% of the business organizations that exist, and usually that give that same amount of employment.
¿Qué hacen ustedes aquí?
¿Qué hacen? Promocionamos lo que es toda la lotización. La inmobiliaria lo que trata es de lotizar, luego vender y financiar en letras. A como cada socio quiere invertir, por ejemplo, quiere comprar una casa, o primero empieza por lotes. Se lo compra, se lo financia, 2, 3 años. Una vez que termina de pagar, se le entrega con luz, agua y desagüe. Eso es lo que hace la inmobiliaria. Le deja saneado todo. Con título de propiedad, registraron los registros públicos, lo que pertenece al Estado y pues, prácticamente queda como propietario el socio.
¿Y cuánto sale una tierra aquí, un lote?
$3.000. $3.000 en letras. Al contado, 2.000 a 2.500. Depende el metraje, depende los metros que haya.
When you go to shanty towns in Peru, they all look very poor, but when you start adding up the replacement value of these houses based on how much cement they've got, how much bricks they've got, is $5,000 for one house, $10,000 for another, $40,000 for another, and you add it all up, you get extraordinary numbers. In the case of just the urban poor in Peru, it's about $36 billion of housing. And if you bring in the agricultural land, you get to about $75 billion. How much is $75 billion of real estate assets in the hands of Peruvian poor? Well, it's about 8 times the size of the Lima Stock Exchange. It is about 60 times the amount of all foreign aid and investment in this country over the last 50 years. And if you add to that the machinery they have, if you add to that the street vendors' implements, their stocks, and their enterprises, and their automobiles, and their buses, and their trucks, you get to about $90 billion. Now, if we extend that to the whole world, the figures we've been finding in Egypt and Peru, they come out to be about between $9 and $10 trillion. What I am putting simply on the table is that if you consider that the poor already have in many countries the majority of the wealth, why not give it to them legally? And if you consider that even if you want to do a land reform, you at least have got to know who owns what today, because otherwise how are you going to reform? You've got to know what the status quo is. You've got to go there in entitle. And that's what we're trying to do in different parts of the world.
¿Qué vendes acá?
Bueno, acá está productos básicos como son huevo, querosene, pan, galletas, tenemos leche, mantequilla, azúcar, aceite, ¿no? Algunos dulces para los niños, para la lonchera. Anteriormente vivía en una casa que era de mi suegra. Éramos prácticamente 4 familias en una sola casa. Y para mí era desesperante y mi pareja se agrupa con grupos de invasores y dado un momento dice, bueno, tienen que irse a Pachacútec porque ahí le vamos a entregar su lote y están listos los camiones para que se los lleve. Y entonces en ese momento recuerdo que tenía a mis alumnos enseñando como siempre lo he hecho. Y bueno, no sabía si venirme porque yo sabía que este sitio no había nada, era un desierto, era un arenal, no había pista, no había nada, ni siquiera una planta. Y me fue chocante y dije, ¿voy o no voy? Y me apuraban y me decían que el camión ya está saliendo, que si te quedas ya vea usted. Entonces agarro un buzo y una sandalia que tenía y me vine así.
The important factor of the modern world is that we're all represented. Our persons and our identities are in our passports or in identity documents. They're not in me. I don't carry my identity. My identity is carried in a representation document. My capacity to pay my hotel bill is carried in my credit card. And my right to transfer property is carried in my property title or in my business registry. The world of capitalism and the world of modern market economies, socialist, third way, radical conservative, whatever you wish, is a world of paper. It's a world of representations. What happens in most of Peru is that most of the things that are owned by most of Peruvians, things that are owned by most of third worlders, are not on paper. So they do not have a legal representation of what they own. What they have are the physical things. In Europe, you have two things, whether you realize it or not. You've got the physical things, and you've got an infrastructure of laws and paper. And that infrastructure of laws and papers is as important to the development of your economy as railways and roads with asphalt and bridges. It allows people that don't know each other to quickly assess whether it's a good idea to do business and interspecialize. And that's why what we say is that the cause of the poverty has to do with law.
Aquí, por favor, señor. Señor. Todo el movimiento. Solamente un día que no voy.
Es una invasión. Estamos organizando, formar una directiva, una nueva directiva para ver pues un avance, ¿no? Pues recién tenemos 1 año y 3 meses. Más que todo queremos título de propiedad. Sin eso no podemos tener nada. Pues. Porque todas las empresas privadas que son agua, luz, son privadas, pues, ¿no? Y no es del gobierno. Así que nosotros para obtener esos servicios queremos pues tener nuestra directiva.
One of the first things we started doing when I came back to Peru and we founded the Institute for Liberty and Democracy was to see if the law was the same for the poor as it was for me. And I asked my lawyer, I said, you know, how long does it take for somebody that's poor to incorporate a business? And he told me, but look, you've put up 3-4 mining companies. How long did it take us? We did it in a month, maybe a bit less. How much of your time? Hours. We sat down, did the statutes, maybe 10 hours of interview with you. What's the big deal? So one of the first things we did was establish a small business with 2 sewing machines, 5 kilometers away from Lima, but put in 5 students who didn't know anything about business, but were clever. They were university students, to go and do all the steps required to legalize the 2 sewing machines as a shop for creating dresses. And it took them 289 days working 8 hours a day. So then we were able to see that the law was not made for the poor. Why? Because among other things, they had to take off from Lima. They didn't have a car. I mean, from outside Lima, they didn't have a car. They had to take a bus. And one office was in this side of Lima. The other office was in this other side of Lima. They were poor, so there were special socialist legislation to protect them from exploitation. There were other right-wing legislation to help them be more entrepreneurial. But all of this meant more writing, more red tape, more other things. And it took them 289 days. And I, who was not poor, could do it in a matter of just a short amount of days. So we started seeing that the law discriminated, that there was a legal apartheid. If you think of the fact that it takes 17 years to get a title to a home on a sand dune in Peru. That in the Philippines it takes 25 to 52 years. That in Egypt it can also take somewhere around 15 years. That in Mexico it can take something around 14 years. Try and figure how big a part of your life goes into just getting the first piece of paper. And since most people can't afford it, people stay out.
Pollo, pollo, pollo.
Without paper, secure interchange can only occur in small restricted groups. And between groups, it is very difficult. And that's why Peru doesn't have a market economy. Peru has thousands of market economies, all little economies, like you did in Europe 400 years ago. Each free town had a system, a registry, a method of enforcement. And of course, things were not interconnected. Even after the Second World War, you Europeans felt you were still not sufficiently interconnected, and you had to create the European Economic Community. Basically, I see history in the commercial sense, a continual development from little systems of organizing property to larger systems. You Europeans, on the one hand with the European Economic Commission, and with the fact that you're expanding the EEC throughout Europe, the Americans trying to create the free trade area for the Americas, are all systems which basically want to enlarge trade and interlocution for finance, for investment, and for commerce, because you want more specialization, you want more wealth, you want higher consumer satisfaction. What we have forgotten in the process, which is what you're now seeing in Peru, is that there is no way for 70 or 80% of Peruvians to get into that global economy. They're not even in the national economy. They're at the level that you were 500 years ago, little nation states with customary law, which cannot be understood by the next community or by government itself. And therefore, it's a market economy, but it's an impoverished market economy because it's restricted in size, and the division of labor on a grand scale is not possible.
¿Usted tiene una tienda formal o no?
No, porque no tenemos ningún título, nada que nos acredite que estos lotes son nuestros. Está en ese proceso, ¿no? Ya va a depender de las autoridades, bueno, ahora transitoria, va a depender de ellos, va a depender de nosotros para poder coordinar y logremos sacar la titulación de nuestros lotes.
¿Y cuando tendrías tú un título, qué haría?
Podría acceder a un crédito, ¿no? Pero aunque siempre ha sido mi temor, ¿no? De repente endeudarme, ¿no? Siempre mi idea ha sido salir por mí misma, ¿no? Pero no estaría de más acceder a un crédito que me pueda facilitar y llenar de repente mi producto como he soñado, ¿no? Tener una tienda grande y donde haya de todo. No tener, por eso le decía, el no tener título es como si estuviéramos en la nada. No tenemos un documento que nos acredite que esto es nuestro.
The costs of being extra-legal as an enterprise are enormous. First of all, because you cannot collateralize what things you own. In other words, you don't have a piece of paper that you can burden and that represents your commitment your interest rates are going to be higher. So, the fact that you are not in the legal system and the fact that you have community property doesn't mean that you don't get credits. You do get credits. Everybody needs credits. The thing is that the interest rates are much higher than if you can commit. And so the credit cost is enormous. The investment cost, of course, is also enormous because who's going to come and take a share of what you've got if you don't have a piece of paper whereby he can guarantee it? So you're all alone. You have no way of bringing assets together. You can't advertise because the cops will come and ask you to pay. Another interesting thing, if you see in Lima buses, you will also see them on all the buses in Peru and in developing countries, lots of Latin Americans there, each one with a package underneath their arm. And you wonder why they transport so many packages. You also see it on airplanes, coming into third world airplane, lots of people putting packages. It's because if they transport in bulk, the tax man comes and then demands bribes against that. So what you do is you have all your brothers and your cousins, each one take a little package to cross town. So the costs of transport are immense just to avoid the tax or to avoid the bribe. So to create a system where everybody becomes legal, you've got to say, what are the benefits of becoming legal? Look at all these things I can do if I'm legal. What are the costs of becoming legal? And then you have to bring them down. So what we are experts at is putting all the good things that you need to have be legal accessible to everybody and bring down the cost of the red tape. Once you've brought the cost of the red tape below the advantage of being legal, everybody comes in. When we started recording small businesses in Peru, about 1990 till 93, we brought in something like 270,000 businesses inside. There wasn't even need for much propaganda. People who are poor live on such thin sliced profits that they are very sensitive, more sensitive than Americans are to the interest rate. They're very sensitive to the cost of legislation. They'll come in automatically if you give it good, normal publicity.
En tu nombre o tu talento está tu oportunidad. En tu negocio, en tu empresa o bien en tu propiedad. Por más humilde que sea tu casa o tu propiedad. Por más humilde que sea tu casa o tu propiedad. La democracia es muy buena, mejor es la libertad. Con capital para todos, todos van a progresar. Tantos siglos de miseria pronto van a terminar. Tantos siglos de miseria pronto van a terminar. ¿Qué haría yo si tuviera capital? ¿Qué haría yo si tuviera capital?
How do you know who owns what in an extra-legal economy?
The technical reply is very long, so let me give you a short reply through a metaphor. About the early 90s, I was called in by the cabinet of Indonesia, the president of the cabinet of Indonesia, to talk to them about our projects in Peru, because I happened to be in Bali at that time after having presented my book. And so I went back to talk to them, and they asked me the same question: how do you know who owns what? And I told them that when I had been in Bali, walking around this beautiful island with all of these fantastic rice fields surrounded by palm trees and pagodas. That's all you do in Bali. You walk around, it's so beautiful. I always knew when I went from one property to another because a different dog would bark. So I told them the way to find out who owns what is ask the Indonesian dogs. They've got all the information. What's behind that, of course, is that it's not the Indonesian dogs who know, it's the neighbors who know. That means to say that all throughout Bali, like all throughout Indonesia, and more than 90% of Indonesia is not titled, people have already agreed among themselves how they're going to distribute it. Even monkeys have agreed who has what territory. So it's not that nobody knows that. Even dogs have territories. The question is, have you put it on paper? And then you can decide what you want to do. But the first thing is identify who has what and let the poor have a break.
As a banker, what are your interests in the ideas of Hernando De Soto?
Peru has not a very deep presence in the banking sector. We haven't developed yet in a proper way the mortgage industry. And if it happens that you only establish elemental regulations to access to the property, and you have the right system to titulize the property, then you should be in a position to develop this industry in a very important way. In a conservative way, you must think that you can almost double your actual demand, you know.
Ik denk dat zijn gedachtegoed zou ontzettend goed aansluiten bij dat van internationaal opererende bedrijven. Ontwikkelende landen zijn voor ons buitengewoon belangrijk. En dat is een heel mooi voorbeeld daarvan, is dat gebied van sociale zekerheid. Want dat is daar in Peru en elders in Latijns-Amerika de grote uitdaging. Hoe kan je de toegang tot zekerheidssystemen, dus employee benefits, zoals het dan tegenwoordig heet, verbreden buiten de groep van de mensen die in de formele economie zitten. En dat moet, want anders dan is het verzekeringstechnisch niet mogelijk. De groep is te klein. Het moet uit sociale overwegingen en uit stabiliteitspolitieke overwegingen. Dus daar is deze redenering, de lijn van gedachten van De Soto, heel relevant voor. En voor ons kan dat dus ook leiden tot een vergroting, verdubbeling, verdriedubbeling van de markt, zeker.
Allá la tierra de don Ernesto Balcázar, y acá el señor Medina, al lado de acá queda el señor del señor Rosselló, más allá de la señora Luz Mila Rojas, después viene de Carlos Morales. Luego así sucesivamente viene, ya muy al fondo viene también ya del señor Guayanca, una parte. Luego el señor José Bustamante.
¿Quién es el propietario de esa tierra?
Yo.
¿Puedo aprobarlo?
Claro.
¿Con qué?
Bueno, si estoy en duda, bueno, pues mis propiedades, o mis papeles, ¿no?
¿En qué día fue el momento en que podía obtener los papeles para su tierra?
95 nos entregan título.
¿Y cómo fue? ¿Qué iba a la alcaldía o qué pasó?
No, ese no, desde aquí fue elegir una comisión. Tramitaron todo con eso, con los ingenieros que teníamos acá en cooperativa. Con todo fue comisión, acá nombraron comisión, un grupo de comisión. Tramitaron todos esos documentos. Nosotros hicimos como una asamblea general acá, recibir nuestros títulos en casa cooperativa.
¿Una asamblea general?
Sí, así fue, para que nos entregaran un título, o sea que fue como una asamblea general, toditito, los parcelarios. Hicimos eso en ese local, ahí recibimos.
Emocionante, ¿no?
Es emocionante, festejamos, bueno, todos compañeros. Bueno, así fue el entrego del título. Esto es naranja Washington. Esas son plantas adultas. Eso se hace, esa planta tiene 59 años, que van a 60 años. Y es porque más que, como dice yo, lo mantengo esto. El futuro estas plantas que estoy poniendo mandarina. O sea que mandarina va a durar 4x4. O sea que es naranja está 8x8. Y esta es plantación, es maracuyá. Este he puesto así para ayudarme un pequeño ingreso que haya para mientras que desarrolle la planta, las mandarinas. Tener parcela, propiedad que tenemos esa ventaja que tenemos. Estamos libres, pero algunos aprovechamos que estamos libres, pues caramba, que también vamos a la calle, pues no, porque están libres, pues no. Pero parece algunos, pero algunos no. Esa libertad hay que saber un poco explotarlo y tratarlo, ¿no? Por eso que yo a hacer renovación en su huerta voy lenta, como tengo alcances, como dice, yo compro el año a veces poniendo 300 o 100 plantas, 200, 300, así vengo poniendo. Me dice, claro, este año no, si no cierro, próximamente ya estoy cerrando ya. Esto todo es naranja, como digo. Este es yuca. Yo planté yuca y naranja. Acá un poco de mango, unos cuantos plantas de mango.
In most places that we have titled so far, it has been places where people themselves had decided that they wanted individual property. We didn't start it. And some of them have done well. The guys with the green thumbs have obviously known how to get more out of the land than the others. And the tendency has been, among equals, for them to buy out or rent from the other ones. Those that knew how to handle the tractor better, in many cases preferred, because of their own vocation, to sell out or rent out and then get into businesses. And this is what's the creation of a market economy. You face up to citizens who now take decisions independently. I would have liked to have gotten to a situation in Peru where, in addition to that, we would have been allowed to perfect the paper so they could have gotten credit much cheaper, because the uncertainties would have also been lower. But we were stopped from doing that because Fujimori then kicked us out because we were, among other things, becoming politically visible. And that's why now we've gone international.
Les podría decir de que en sí la titulación para unos les fue bien, para otros les fue mal, de acuerdo a la economía en que se encontraba en ese momento. Otros optaron por vender. Sí, y acá mismo, acá al costado, es una tierra, hay 2 tierras que están vendidas. Esos son a personas más pudientes, personas que están en mejores condiciones, fueron las que la adquirieron. Sí. La gente que han vendido, en verdad, yo conozco su situación y hay muchos, o más claro, la mayoría lamentan la situación en que lo vendieron. Desesperados al no contar con medios para afrontar el trabajo de la chacra, lo vendieron y luego optaron por comprar carro. Hicieron arreglos en su casa, pensando que al comprar carro, bueno, pensaban que el carro le iba a dar siempre, pero no se dieron cuenta que había un momento en que el carro también se iba a malograr, iba a necesitar reparación, pintar y muchas cosas, y su situación de ellos es lamentable, es lamentable. Ellos están en una situación muy mala, se encuentran.
El taxi es propiedad de mi padre, pero yo lo estoy trabajando. Y bueno, él lo adquirió con la venta de su terreno o cultivo agrícola que tenía. Y para buscar una mejora familiar, no es que acá con la agricultura estaba muy dejada. Es por eso que ahora tenemos este negocio, un pequeño negocio, pero lamentablemente la situación está tan mala que no rinde, sinceramente no rinde.
¿Y entonces la titulación ha matado con la pobreza o ha ayudado a la pobreza?
No, más bien ha aumentado la pobreza, no ha podido ayudar. No ha habido un buen apoyo de parte para la agricultura, mejor dicho. Los bancos te prestaban, pero te cobraban muchos intereses y en vez de ayudar, hacía que te endeudaras mucho más.
we've reached in Peru a position where nearly everybody now has titles. We even had a position before, which was unfortunately dismantled, where we had also brought in all the small enterprise systems into a record-keeping system, and they gave the government an enormous amount of taxes. It was a very good times in Peru in the early 90s, had even one of the highest, if not the highest growth rate in the world. All of that, unfortunately, was disassembled as we broke company, if you want to, with Fujimori for political reasons, among other things. So in terms of achievement, people now know where they should be, but the title is not yet that liquid. We have been working with it in the last 6 years. Hopefully now that there's a new government, we can get back into it.
El sistema en que vivimos no nos da oportunidad. ¿Cómo habríamos de tenerla si nos niegan capital? La riqueza de unos pocos no es bienestar nacional. La riqueza de unos pocos no es bienestar nacional. ¿Qué haría yo si tuviera capital? ¿Qué haría yo si tuviera capital? ¿Qué haría yo si tuviera capital?
La informalidad no es el tema central de la economía peruana. Hernando De Soto ha hecho un gran avance para ver cuán burocrático es el proceso de incorporarse de la informalidad a la formalidad. Pero el problema de la informalidad no es un problema legal, como lo plantea Hernando De Soto. No es solo un problema de burocracia que impide, porque hay muchos trámites para llegar a la formalidad. Lo es, pero eso no es el problema central. El problema es económico-social. El niñito que vende periódicos, la señora que vende comida en la calle. Esa señora simplemente no puede pagar impuestos. Está trabajando para subsistencia. Es un problema económico-social, no es un problema legal.
Peru, since the end of the Second World War, every year produces 28,000 laws. 28,000. That means 106 laws per working day. At a rate of 106 laws per working day, those that are well informed, those that have the law firms with which they can get into the decision-making process, can obviously twist it in their own direction. If you had the processes that we have, as a matter of fact, introduced in the Peruvian Constitution, but that have not been implemented by Fujimori, and that Toledo doesn't even talk about, whereby the institutions and the laws are discussed openly before, and we can make a cost-benefit analysis of their possible consequences and an ex post analysis of the effects that they did have, I assure you we're going to be able to get that corruption much more, because the process will be transparent. So institutions are extremely important. So if you get a head of state, or somebody's going to have a head of state and says development is a social economic problem and has little to do with institutions, he doesn't even know the best weapons, not only to get economic development, but to fight corruption, because corruption of the major type that we're talking about is the one where you privilege yourself through the laws. The clean corruption, where nobody can touch you and put you in jail because you did everything according to the law, but the law was something that you made yourself.
Mientras quien mande no entienda el misterio del capital, no importa quién nos gobierne, la cosa seguirá igual. No importa quién nos gobierne, la cosa seguirá igual. Para resolver el misterio, la historia debe cambiar, cambiando las estructuras de un sistema desigual. Cuando quien gobierna entienda.
might argue that you're just a hardcore capitalist, favoring capitalism.
Yeah. You know, the problem about these arguments, of course, is that they fit very well in the conservative modes of people. And therefore, the tendency in the West is to consider this as right-wingers. It's a problem. And the result, of course, is that we have a lot of sympathy from libertarians, because we have adopted many of their things, and from conservatives, because we have adopted many of their things. But interestingly enough, in developing countries, most of my clients of heads of state are on the left. The people on the left who don't like us are the politicians in our countries and the leftists of sometimes Western countries.
Why?
Because the property argument has essentially been a rightist argument.
Lente, vaya. Eso me es gallo. Yo soy comerciante gallo, no jugador, no siempre juego, pero así con los amigos vamos a jugar, ¿no? Y, bueno, pues como dice, tan rústico, pero de aquí más para adelante estoy pensando hacer un casillero más adecuado, ¿no? Y en primer lugar quiero hacer primero casillero, o sea, como después ya mi casa tomaré de acá, ¿no? Unos 160, 170 metros cuadrados, ¿no? Hacerme mi casa con material noble y hacer mi puente, todo eso, canalizar esas sequías, hacerme un corralón acá prácticamente, cerrar todo, y poner un buen portón. Y ese es que tengo, mira, adelante, ¿no? Como ahorita, como dice, esa inversión es un capital muerta. Y la verdad que si hago eso, pues no voy a hacer nada en el campo, ¿no? En el campo también necesita dinero, si no dinero no hace, porque el dinero es una herramienta de trabajo. Y bueno, ojalá, como dice, que Dios que permita, pues no lo que son mis planes que tengo.
The philosophy of Hernando De Soto, is that in the end the magic bullet?
There are, as you know, people who accuse us of thinking that there's a magic bullet here, that this idea that capital, which is to say the value, the inherent, invisible value, unexploited value, that poor people themselves have as well, we say is enhanced through law. That it is law and legal representations that are able to carry it. And that the lack of law and legal representations means that much of this is wasted. That is, as you understand, the philosophy. That doesn't mean that it's the only instrument for growth. Education continues to be one, definitely. Good health is also important, absolutely. Stable economics, good macroeconomic policies, a stable currency is also important. So I don't pretend to have a magic bullet. I just pretend that a major aspect of development is law, and it hasn't been touched upon. And of course, I have a technique. Everybody in his book has a strategy. And my strategy in the book of The Mystery of Capital is not to give an overview of underdevelopment and all its causes. It simply has an objective to see the world through a missing institution. And of course, the result is that some people get angry. But again, that is also part of the debate. All of this will come up, and I assure you that the argument that De Soto believes that this is a magic bullet will gradually disappear. It's simply that I argue one idea per book, and on the one hand, and secondly, I argue, I think, with a certain degree of passion, which gives this aura of magic bullet, but I don't think anywhere in the world anybody will ever see that I believe it's the only possible solution. But it is, I think, the major stumbling block today.